Hello, Elisa. Hope you guys had a great weekend. Yes, my son and I, we actually went camping yesterday. And when he asked me how to build a fire, I simply said you just take two sticks and you rub them together, but just make sure that they're the same. And of course, he then replies, "Oh, so then you'll have a match." And that was the joke of the day. All right. I hope all is well. For today, we get to start the story of Watergate. Um, which is long and convoluted with lots of names. So it does get confusing. So bear with me as we kind of go through this, as we try to do this. But yeah, also a friendly reminder that next week, right, is your greatest American artist. Right, so that research project is due next week. So hopefully that is progressing. Who am I kidding? You haven't started. But anyway, start it, get it done, because it's due next week. Okay. And that'll probably be the last big grade 100-point thing for the quarter. Okay. So you have that. I hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and I'll talk to you guys later. So today we'll begin our conversations about Watergate. And Watergate becomes the political scandal in which all other political scandals are judged. So, to kind of begin examining what the heck goes on and why does it go on, we just learn or talk a little bit about Richard Nixon and his own personal psychology. Richard Nixon was from California. He grew up poor. He grew up on a lemon farm, and it was a lemon farm that was not very profitable. His father had to wind up selling the lemon farm when the family went broke. And of course, the next people that bought the farm discovered oil on the land and they got very rich. Nixon couldn't go to the best schools. He wound up going to Whittier College, which is a small Quaker school in California. Um, and then when it came time to go to law schools, he wanted to go to Harvard, wanted to go to Yale, couldn't get into Harvard, couldn't get into Yale, had to go to Duke, which now seems great. Yeah, you went to Duke. But back in the day, Duke was not known as a top flight law school around the country. And if you look at his political career, this idea that everything was kind of against him, nothing was going his way. He had to fight for everything. Um, that was his life growing up. He had an older brother who he adored, who died when he was a teenager. The family actually picked up and moved to Arizona, thinking it'd be better for his health. So he was even uprooted as a result of this. Um, Nothing went his way. And then when you looked into politics, this kind of informed his politics. So the things we've already talked about in terms of Nixon running HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. Remember, it is Nixon who took down Alger Hiss, and Alger Hiss represents everything he despised. Alger Hiss came from money. Alger Hiss was one of those New England elite snobs. These are the people Nixon resented. So these are the people he went after. And then we saw him, possibly getting kicked off the presidential ticket in 1952, and he has to give that checker speech. And when you have the political elite who kind of like want to get rid of him and replace him, and Eisenhower himself doesn't even like him that much. And so he has to fight for his political life there. Then you have the election of 1960 against John F. Kennedy, in which he narrowly loses. And again, it's a really close election. The popular vote, it's really tight. And again, Nixon believes he's a better candidate, but John F. Kennedy's a media darling. He's just the pretty face. He's a lightweight, and again, it's the Kennedys and the Kennedy money. And Nixon believed to his dying day that the Kennedys fixed that election against him, and he resented the Kennedys to his dying day as a result of it. In 1964, Nixon ran for the governorship of California. Again, loses a really close election. And this he blames the media, blames the press. And in his press conference, where he basically says his political career is over, he famously tells the press, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." And then Nixon comes back in 1968, wins the Republican nomination, and again he becomes president, but again in a really close, narrow election. And so all of this is informing Nixon's presidency as he begins preparing for reelection. Everything was close. He had to claw for everything he had. Um, and even while he was president, the press he felt was still out to get him. Two lessons ago we saw that foreign policy victory with China, and there was a reading that I included in which you see how he kind of was resentful to the press for not reporting it favorably or just moving on from it. And he actually says if Ted Kennedy had done it, that they'd still be talking about it. So again, you have that resentment. And so all this feeds into them. And so there was a lot of people he didn't trust. He actually had an enemies list. He used the FBI, the CIA, the IRS to go after people he felt were not loyal to him, not loyal to the country. And he actually had an organization. I don't know if organization is the right word, but he had a group of people that worked out of the White House that he referred to as the plumbers. And the job of a plumber is to fix leaks. And so what every administration has leaks. They have information that's coming out that they don't want to get out. So the job of these men was to make sure that these leaks didn't happen. And so on your screen here, you see G. Gordon Liddy. He's the figure on the left, and Howard Hunt, who is on the right. And their job, again, was to basically prevent people from telling secrets about the Nixon presidency. And so, an example of the kind of stuff they did was that there was a gentleman by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg worked at the Pentagon. And what Daniel Ellsberg did was he stole about 7,000 pages of secret documents about the Vietnam War. The documents said nothing about Nixon, um, but they talked about basically U.S. It was a history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And what these papers revealed is that the American public was being lied to. And so what Ellsberg does is he gives these photocopies of these papers to the Washington Post and the New York Times, who begins printing them. And what Nixon does, he goes to the Supreme Court and tries to basically censor these newspapers. The Supreme Court very quickly and unanimously rules against Nixon. Nixon, though, needs to discredit Ellsberg. So what he does is he has the plumbers find out that Ellsberg sees a psychiatrist. He then has these men basically break into the psychiatrist's office and try to find Ellsberg's file, with the thought being is that they could then blackmail Ellsberg and stop him from doing anything else. These guys break in, they make a mess of the place, they don't find what they're looking for, but they trash it, and they don't cover their tracks very well. And so basically there has to be some little cover-up activity to make sure nobody finds out about this. But these men are basically kicked out of the White House. They can't be around the White House anymore because they could be implicated in this burglary. So Nixon, though, is loyal to people who are loyal to him. So while they don't work at the White House anymore, or don't work for the administration, what Nixon does is he hires them to work for his reelection campaign. And so Nixon's reelection campaign is affectionately known as CREEP, or the Committee to Reelect the President. And their job is to basically get Nixon reelected in 1972. And they're not taking anything for granted, since every other election he had was so close. So now, with the plumbers working for the reelection campaign, they begin doing the dirty tricks type stuff that they were doing before. And at the Watergate building complex, which you see on the left, this was the schwanky, bougie kind of like hotel complex in Washington, D.C. Real expensive penthouses, and so $250,000 got you a penthouse apartment. $3,500 got you just a parking space, right? These are 1972 prices. And inside this swanky office and residence complex, the Democratic National Committees had their headquarters. So what CREEP organizes is that they are going to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters, and they're going to put taps on their phones so they can listen in on the conversations. So they break in to the Democratic National Committee headquarters, they put taps on the phones, they sneak out and start listening to the taps. Problem is the taps didn't work, so they have to break in again. And it is on their second time breaking in that they're caught. And a bunch of men are caught inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Are brought and arraigned, and these men are all dressed nicely. They're they're in really nice suits. Some of these men are Cuban. They all have lots of money on them, lots of $100 bills, and the $100 bills are in sequential order, right? So the serial numbers on the bills all follow one another. Um, it just looks weird. Um, the break-in is reported locally. I mean, the New York Times actually does report about it as well. It's on page 30. Nobody thinks too much about it. Um, when the men are arraigned, though, then some like interesting things start happening, and it is at the arraignment where the judge in charge of this, whose name is John Sirica, basically asks everybody, state your name, where do you work, and how do you plead? And when he gets to one of the burglars, a guy by the name of James McCord whispers that he works for the CIA. And so now things start getting a little bit interesting. Um, and what you have are local reporters for the Washington Post, um, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who then begin reporting about this. And right now, nobody thinks it's a story. It's just a third rate burglary. And this is actually what the Nixon press secretary called it, a third rate burglary. Um, and that, and eventually when Nixon is asked about this, and you see the quote on there, that categorically no one in the White House staff, right, presently employed. That's the key word, presently employed, because a lot of those members of CREEP were plumbers. And if you work for CREEP, you're not technically working for the administration. You're working for somebody else, right? And so Woodward and Bernstein start looking into this, and they begin writing stories and stories about this. And what's helping them is that they have a secret source, and their secret source is a guy inside the government who simply goes by the name Deep Throat. And Deep Throat, well, is a pun on the idea that you have a source who's giving you this information, but Deep Throat was also the name of a porn movie that was popular at the time. Um, and Deep Throat keeps encouraging Woodward and Bernstein to keep going, keep reporting, and so they do keep reporting. Meanwhile, we have the election of 1972, and in the election of 1972, Nixon, as you see, easily defeats George McGovern. George McGovern really never had a chance. George McGovern was painted as a radical. George McGovern was in favor of decriminalization of marijuana. He was talking about providing amnesty for any draft dodgers. He also was talking about income redistribution. That's radical stuff in 1972. Heck, it's radical stuff today. And as you can see, he never really gained traction, and Nixon wins overwhelmingly in 1972. And of course, everybody believed that this should put an end to the Watergate reportings, but it doesn't. Woodward and Bernstein keep going. They keep digging, and their secret source, Deep Throat, keeps providing them with information, and the stories don't go away.